Shana Tova. As we're approaching Rosh Hashanah this year, one of the things that's the most powerful is thinking about hearing the blasts of the shofar. It's something we normally do in community, and there are people who have had this job even sometimes for years and years who are the custodians of this mitzvah, of this very sacred practice for us. And every year sometimes, and this year particularly, there are challenging situations where we can't necessarily be in public. People find themselves isolated, needing to fulfill and connect to various mitzvot and practices, perhaps at home. And the shofar can be one of the things that's challenging to do on your own. And while I can't actually teach you how to physically blow a shofar over a video presentation like this, one of the things that we do want to offer is a kind of tutorial of how to blow the shofar on your own. If you know how to actually blow the physical instrument, how to do it right, how to fulfill the requirement of hearing this special sound on Rosh Hashanah. So we're going to go over some of the background of how we get to this mitzvah, what its structure is, what its components are, and then we'll very technically go through how to make it happen if you need to do this for yourself or for people in your home this year. So let's start. How do we get to the mitzvah of blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah? Well, the Torah, in describing this day, described as the first day of the 7th month, which we know as the beginning of our year, that day is described in two places as a zichron tru'ah, a day that is a kind of remembrance brought about through tru'ah, a kind of horn blast, which we'll come back to define later. In another place, it's described as Yom Tru'ah, the day of the horn blast. And that notion of a tru'ah, of there being a kind of prescribed horn blast on a day of the year, also comes up when the Torah is discussing the Jubilee year, when it says that once every 50 years, B'Yom HaKippurim, on Yom Kippur, it says, V'ha'avarta shofar tru'ah. You shall cause the sound of a horn making a horn blast to pass through your land. Our sages, Chazal, picked up on the three occurrences of the word tru'ah, of this horn blast in the Torah, and understood it to point to a threefold, 3 times repeated blast that has to be sounded in Tishrei, in the 7th month, on Rosh Hashanah. So even though 2 of the occurrences really are about the first day of the 7th month, the other one appears around Yom Kippur, they form a kind of midrashic and evocative package of 3 blasts. The notion that there are 3 main sounds that we need to hear on Rosh Hashanah. That's piece 1. Piece 2 is that in B'midbar, in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, there's a discussion of the ways in which horns, in this case trumpets, were used to kind of gather and organize the camp. And we hear there in the Torah how there were actually 2 kinds of blasts, a tekiyah and a teruah. The tekiyah is a blast that we're told is meant to gather the people, and it seems to be a long sound, a long blowing, constant sound. And the teruah is focused on movement, on telling the people they have to move and get going. And the teruah is some kind of broken sound, something that indicates that there's sort of a pace and a rhythm, almost a marching order, telling you to get going. And that has all kinds of deep resonances for what it is we're doing when we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah and we hear these different sounds. There's some degree of pulling us together to a place of focus and some degree of motivating us to move forward. But what's important about that passage in the book of Numbers is that it indicates that perhaps the way you are supposed to blow a teruah, one of these broken sounds, is that it should be preceded and followed by a tekiyah. The Torah says, utekatem teruah, and it says, teruah yitkeu, using the term of tekiyah once before the term teruah and once after the term teruah. And this gets us to our second basic requirement, the notion that when we blow the shofar, we are always doing some form of a solid blast of tekiyah at the beginning, a solid blast of tekiyah at the end, and a broken sound of teruah in the middle, and we'll need to do that 3 times to accord with the 3 appearances of the word teruah in the Torah. Great. So far, we've built up to what seem to be 9 components. Tekiah, teruah, tekiah, tekiah, teruah, tekiah, tekiah, teruah, tekiah. And if one hears those blasts, one will fulfill the core obligation of hearing the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. But there's one last wrinkle, which is precisely defining what is a teruah. What exactly is that broken blast? And we find in the Talmud a debate, perhaps a record of competing traditions, which suggests that maybe there are at least 3 different ways of understanding what that sound is. One is a gnicha, a kind of a moaning or a wailing, a sound that sounds something like, ugh. And that is the sound that we know as shivarim in our conventional usage. Another tradition says perhaps the teruah is best described as a yilala, a kind of high-pitched hollering noise. And that is what we know of as our conventionally described teruah. Or perhaps it is both of those together, the sound of a person moaning followed by some kind of high-pitched, pierced cry. And that creates 3 possibilities for what the teruah that we're trying to sound actually is. In our terminology, it either could be a shivarim, which is a set of 3 broken kind of groaning noises, as opposed to it might be a teruah, 9 piercing short blasts, or it might be a shivarim teruah, a kind of mashup of those 2 sounds, 3 slightly longer sounds and 9 short piercing ones. Just to give the feel of what all of these sound like, the tekiah is the long straight blast, and it will sound something like this. The shivarim, the gnicha, the moaning sound in 3 parts will sound like this. The teruah will sound like 9 piercing sounds, 9 or more. And shivarim teruah together would sound like this. That's the package that we'll put together to create the traditional understanding of how one fulfills the obligation of shofar on Rosh Hashanah. You need 3 teruot. You need a tekiah before and after the teruah each time. And there are 3 versions of the teruot that you need to play out. Shvarim, teruah, shivarim, teruah. And that will give you as a total, if you count shvarim teruah as one kind of elongated sound, 27 different sounds, basically, that you need to make in order to go through the set of the required sounds. There's one other important dimension here, and then we'll get to demonstrating what this sounds like and how it works. Since the tekiyot before and after the middle sound are meant to be kind of companions to that middle sound, the tekiah before and after the sound in the middle has to be as long as the sound in the middle. So if you've got a teruah in the middle, which is 9 of those piercing things, the tekiah has to be long enough that it could cover the sound of 9 short piercing blasts. If you have a shivarim in the middle, it needs to be long enough to cover those 3 longer groaning sounds, each of which is about the length of 3 little piercing blasts. And if you've got the shivarim teruah in the middle, well, then basically you need a tekiah that can cover the length of about 18 piercing blasts because you've got 9 and 3 times 3, which is 9, in the middle. That means that when you're blowing shofar, you have to be conscious of which set of blasts you are in so that the tekiah is of the appropriate length. If you're trying to kind of translate this into conventional time, more or less it means that the tekiyot in the longer set of Shevarim Teruah, those have to be about 4 seconds long, whereas in the shorter Shevarim and Teruah on their own sets, it would need to be about 2 seconds long each. The conventional order in which this is done is you first do 3 sets of Tekiyah, Shevarim Teruah, Tekiyah, and then 3 sets of Tekiyah, Shevarim, and Tekiyah, and then 3 sets of Tekiyah, Teruah, and Tekiyah. One final thing that's not really part of the statutory requirement here, but a very long held and cherished by many practice, is to make the last tekiyah, the last blast, a tekiyah gedolah, as long as the person who's blowing it can possibly hold the note, a sense of closure to the whole ritual, and a sense that the divine presence is really sort of going up in the sound of this magnificent blast. Let's start with the first set of blasts. The 3 repetitions of the Shevarim Teruah joint sound, preceded and followed by the longer tikiyot of 4 seconds each. And you'll note 4 seconds sounds like a short amount of time, but it's actually significant when you are blowing the shofar. You really want to make sure that for this set, the sounds are longer. That gives you a sense of how that set sounds. If you make a mistake, you do the wrong note, you just wipe out that line. So let's say you got the first line, Tekiyah, Shvarim, Teruah, Tekiyah, right. And then in the second line, you did a Tekiyah, and then you did a Teruah on its own because you got confused. You go back and restart that line, do a new Tekiyah, and begin the process again of getting that second Shevarim Teruah correct. So each line sort of stands on its own with its own integrity. If you mess up on the third iteration, you don't have to go back and repeat the entire process. You just have to fill in that third line that you didn't get right. But you do need to go back and restart the tekiyah at the beginning, because the tekiyah, remember, is not really a note on its own. It's just meant to accompany what's in the middle. Here's the second set. You'll hear the tekiyot are shorter, clocking in at closer to 2 seconds. And now we'll do only Shevarim in the middle. In terms of taking breaths, you want to make sure you take a small breath between each note, but you don't take a breath in the middle of the shvarim. The short 3 notes are certainly not in the midst of the 9 short piercings. There are different traditions as to whether you take a breath between shvarim and teruah when you do them together. Both are ultimately acceptable practices. You should do what makes the most sense in terms of feeling that the note will come out effectively. Here's the last set, the teruah in the middle. And I will continue at the end with the Tekiyah Gedolah, that traditional lengthened blast that closes out this set and the entire package. That gives you a little bit of the dramatic flourish at the end. The teruah there in the middle, you heard, I was sometimes doing more than 9. You want to make sure you have at least 9, but if you lengthen it beyond that, that's okay. If you're used to hearing these blasts in the Beit Knesset, in the synagogue, in public, you know that normally someone is calling out these blasts for you. And certainly if you are at home and someone is able to sit there with a machzor that has printed out these sets of 3 shvarim teruah, 3 shvarim, and 3 teruah, certainly someone should call them for you. So you can focus just on the actual physical act of blowing and don't have to worry about losing your place. If you are doing it on your own, you do not call out the words tekiah, shvarim, teruah. You just go ahead and blow it yourself. Ideally, have a machzor in front of you or something so that you're not only keeping mental track of where you are, but you perhaps have a visual aid that can help make sure you're in the right place at the right time. Again, if in doubt that you did a certain line correctly, just go back and repeat the entire line from the first tekiah, following through the proper sound in the middle and the tekiah that comes at the end. If you're worried you got the wrong note, the tekiah wasn't long enough, any of those things, you can just go back and fix it. That's the nice thing about blowing shofar, particularly when you're doing it for yourself. You're not really inconveniencing hundreds of people who are waiting for you to get it right. So take the time and make sure you've fulfilled the mitzvah. I hope this is a meaningful year of connection to Rosh Hashanah, connection to the shofar. If you are blowing the shofar at home for yourself, may you really connect deeply with this sound that has accompanied the Jewish people throughout time and place and is such a powerful reminder of the presence of God in our lives.